The sky was painted in warm gold that evening, stretching wide over the quiet land of Arizona in 1883. It was spring, but the air carried the last bit of winter's chill. The sun hung low like a tired traveler ready to rest behind the faraway hills. The land was still except for the soft wind that moved through the cottonwood trees along the San Pedro River. Birds flew low over the water, and the air smelled like wet earth and wild sage. Jacob Holloway stood on the edge of his small piece of land, his boots buried in the dust. His hands rested on the wooden fence he had built himself years ago. His cabin, a simple wooden structure with a small porch, sat a few yards behind him. It wasn't a big house, but it was his. It had kept him warm during cold nights and safe during storms. Life wasn't easy out here, but Jacob had made peace with the quiet. Jacob was a tall man with sunburned skin from years of working under the desert sun. His hair was brown, streaked with gray, and his beard was uneven because he usually forgot to shave. His clothes were worn but clean, a faded shirt, dusty trousers, and an old hat that had seen better days. His eyes were a pale shade of green, steady and quiet, like someone who had spent too much time alone. He lived on the edge of a small town, a day's ride away. People in town knew him as the man who didn't talk much. Some said he had once worked on cattle drives. Others said he came west after losing everything back east. But Jacob never confirmed or denied any story. He simply lived his days the same way, working the land, hunting small game, fixing fences, and spending evenings by the fire with a book or the sound of the river. The San Pedro River flowed not far from his cabin. It wasn't a big river, but during the spring when the mountain snow melted, the water rushed fast and strong. It glittered under the sun like a silver ribbon cutting through the dry land. Jacob had learned to respect the river. It could look gentle, but when the rains came, it turned wild. That evening, he stood by the fence watching the clouds gather slowly in the distance. They were dark and heavy, moving across the sky like an army. He could tell a storm was coming. The desert had a way of changing its mood quickly, quiet one moment, roaring the next. Jacob turned and walked back to his cabin. He grabbed his old lantern and lit it, then set it on the porch railing. He liked to keep the light on during storms. It made the night feel less empty. He walked around his property, making sure everything was tied down. The wind was picking up and the air had that sharp smell that always came before rain. Inside the cabin, Jacob poured himself a cup of black coffee. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the sound of the wind brushing against the window. Then something changed. It was faint at first and almost too soft to notice. But after years of living alone, Jacob had learned to listen carefully to the world around him. He stood up and stepped onto the porch. The wind was blowing stronger now. The lantern light flickered. The sound came again, a cry, distant but sharp, carried by the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a bird. It was a human sound. Jacob's heart started to beat a little faster. He grabbed his hat and hurried toward the river. The ground was soft from the first drops of rain. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became. It was high and trembling, the cry of a child. When he reached the riverbank, the water was already moving fast. The rain was falling harder now, tapping against his hat and shoulders. Jacob scanned the river with sharp eyes, trying to see through the shadows and the water's movement. Then he saw it, a small figure caught in the current. A young girl was struggling, her arms splashing weakly, her dark hair tangled around her face. She looked terrified, though her face was pale from the cold water. Jacob's mind didn't have time to think. His body just moved. He threw off his coat and stepped into the water. The current pushed hard against him, but he was strong from years of working the land. The cold bit at his legs, but he kept moving forward. The girl's small hands disappeared under the water for a second, and Jacob felt his heart squeeze tight. "Hold on," he shouted, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the rush of the river. He waded in deeper, water reaching his waist, then his chest. He stretched out his arm. The girl's hair brushed against his fingers, and he grabbed hold. She was light, too light. Jacob pulled with all the strength he had, stepping carefully backward so he wouldn't lose his balance. The current tried to pull both of them down, but he pushed against it. Slowly, step by step, he made his way back to the bank. When they finally reached the edge, Jacob lifted the girl into his arms. She was shivering badly, her lips blue from the cold. Her eyes were wide and frightened, but she was breathing. He wrapped her in his coat and hurried toward his cabin, the rain falling heavier now, soaking his back. Inside, he placed her gently near the fire and covered her with a thick wool blanket. He added more wood to the flames until the room glowed warm. The girl lay still at first, weak and silent. Jacob crouched beside her, not sure what language she spoke or if she would understand him at all. He could tell she was Apache by her features and her traditional dress, a simple, earth-colored garment now soaked through. He had heard stories about Apache people from other settlers, stories that weren't always kind. But Jacob had lived long enough to know that most stories were made bigger by fear. Right now, this wasn't a story about tribes or sides. This was a child, alone, cold and in trouble. He brought her a cup of warm water and held it out. She hesitated, but then took a small sip. Her hands trembled as she held the cup. Jacob gave a small nod, trying to show she was safe. She watched him carefully, her dark eyes alert but no longer full of panic. Hours passed slowly. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire cracked and hissed. Jacob sat in the wooden chair beside her, half awake, ready to help if she needed anything. At one point, she mumbled something softly in her language. He didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. She was calling for someone. Maybe her family was out there searching for her right now. Maybe she had been caught in the river while trying to cross. The thought weighed on him. He couldn't imagine the fear her parents must feel. The storm finally began to quiet. The wind softened and the steady beat of rain slowed to a gentle patter. Jacob checked on the girl again. She was breathing steadily now. Curled up near the fire, her small face calm in sleep. He walked to the window and looked out into the night. The river still moved fast, its surface reflecting the moonlight. Somewhere beyond those trees, her people were out there. He didn't know what would happen when they found her. Some settlers would have been afraid, maybe even locked the door and kept their guns close. But Jacob didn't see enemies. He saw a father's fear, a family's hope. He returned to his chair and sat down again. The room smelled like wood smoke and damp clothes. He felt tired, but it wasn't the heavy kind of tired that came from working all day. It was a deep, quiet weight that came from doing something that mattered. He glanced at the turquoise necklace hanging on the wall, a gift from years past when he had helped a traveling merchant. That day had been unexpected too. Life on the frontier had a way of surprising a man when he least expected it. Jacob leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of the rescued girl. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, in the middle of a storm in a lonely cabin by the river, two lives had crossed in a way neither could have planned. Morning arrived slowly over the desert. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind clean, cool air that smelled of wet soil and wild sage. The sun climbed gently over the distant hills, turning the land into a soft gold. Drops of water hung from every leaf and branch, shining like tiny stars. The San Pedro River still moved quickly, but its wild rush had calmed. Birds returned to the trees, chirping brightly as if to welcome the new day. Inside the small cabin, the fire had burned low but still gave off a warm glow. Jacob sat at the table, sipping a cup of coffee, his eyes watching the small bundle of wool blankets near the hearth. The young Apache girl was still asleep, curled up like a fawn, her hair spread around her face like a dark halo. She had slept through the night, safe and warm. Jacob had barely slept. His body was tired, but his mind had stayed awake, thinking about what would happen next. He knew she must have a family somewhere nearby. She was too young to be alone. Maybe they were already looking for her. Maybe they were frightened just as she had been in the water last night. He also thought about how her family might feel about finding her in a stranger's cabin. Would they trust him, or would they see him as a danger? The thought made his heart beat a little faster. The girl stirred slowly, her small hands tightening around the edge of the blanket. Her eyes opened, wide and alert, like a bird listening for danger. For a second she looked lost, not knowing where she was. Then her gaze found Jacob sitting quietly at the table. Their eyes met. She didn't move. He didn't either. Jacob gave her a gentle nod, the way he might greet a shy animal that needed time to trust. He didn't want to frighten her. He pointed toward the cup of warm water he had set on the floor near her the night before. She watched his hand carefully, then slowly sat up. The blanket fell from her shoulders, revealing her simple earth-colored dress now dry from the fire's heat. She reached for the cup, still cautious, and took a small sip. Jacob smiled softly. "Good morning," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. But his tone was kind and calm, and tone could speak when language could not. She didn't respond with words, but she looked at him with less fear now. Her dark eyes were sharp, taking in every small detail of the cabin. The old table, the shelves of tools, the chair, the fire, and finally the door that led outside. She glanced at the door more than once. She was thinking of leaving, Jacob could tell. But she was weak, and the world outside was still cold and wet. Jacob stood slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. He walked to the small pot on the stove and stirred the oatmeal he had cooked earlier. The smell of warm oats filled the room. He poured some into a wooden bowl and placed it gently on the floor a few feet away from her, then stepped back and returned to his chair. He didn't push the food toward her. He let her decide. For a long moment, she just stared at the bowl. Then hunger won. She moved closer and began to eat carefully, as if still unsure if it was truly safe. Jacob pretended to be busy fixing something on the table, giving her space to eat in peace. It wasn't much, just warm oats. But to someone who had spent the night in a storm, it was comfort. As she ate, Jacob thought about the river. He wondered how far she had traveled in the water. There was no easy way a child could end up there alone. Maybe she had slipped while trying to cross. Maybe she had wandered too close to the riverbank. He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. Someone would be coming for her. When she finished eating, she set the bowl down carefully, almost politely. She kept her small hands wrapped in the edge of the blanket. Jacob could see the strength in her eyes, a quiet, proud kind of strength that didn't belong to someone helpless. She might be a child, but she was also a daughter of the land. Jacob walked toward the door and opened it slowly. Bright sunlight spilled into the cabin. Outside, the world looked fresh and new after the storm. The cottonwood trees swayed gently and the sound of the river filled the air. He stepped out onto the porch and turned back, leaving the door open. He wanted her to see that she wasn't a prisoner. She could step outside if she wished. The girl hesitated for a moment, then rose to her feet. She walked carefully, still holding the blanket around her shoulders, and stopped at the doorway. The sunlight touched her face, and for the first time, her expression softened just a little. She stepped out onto the porch, looking at everything. The trees, the fence, the river, the faraway hills. This was her land too, even if his cabin stood on it. Jacob leaned against the porch railing, hands in his pockets, pretending to look at the river so she wouldn't feel watched too closely. After a few quiet minutes, he said softly, "They'll come for you." She didn't understand the words, but something in his voice made her turn toward him. Their eyes met again. She didn't look scared this time, just thoughtful. The sound of hooves in the distance made both of them freeze. It was faint at first, like a soft drumbeat rolling through the hills. Then it grew louder. Someone was riding fast. Jacob's heart gave a small jump. This was it. He had expected this moment, but now that it was here, 100 thoughts rushed through his mind. The girl heard it too. Her head turned sharply toward the sound, and her eyes lit up with something new, hope. She stepped off the porch and ran a few yards forward, her bare feet brushing against the wet ground. She scanned the horizon. Jacob followed her gaze. Far beyond the river bend, a group of figures appeared on horseback, riding swiftly toward them. The riders moved with the ease and grace of people who belonged to the land. Even from a distance, Jacob could tell they were Apache. The girl lifted her hand high, waving the blanket like a signal. A small smile broke across her face for the first time. She wasn't alone anymore. Jacob's stomach tightened, not with fear but with caution. He knew this was a delicate moment. He had heard enough stories to understand that trust between settlers and Apache people was rare. Misunderstandings could happen easily. He didn't want this to turn into something it wasn't. The riders drew closer, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. There were 6 of them moving in a line, their faces serious and watchful. At the front rode an older man with long dark hair streaked with gray. His posture was proud and his eyes sharp like an eagle's. Even from a distance, Jacob could see the strength in him. He had the presence of a leader, maybe the girl's father. The girl took a few steps forward, her arms opening slightly as if ready to run toward him. The man at the front slowed his horse. The others followed his lead. They approached the cabin carefully, their movements smooth but alert, like people who trusted nothing too quickly. Jacob raised both hands slowly, palms open, showing he held no weapon. He kept his movements calm. He wanted them to see that he meant no harm. The older man dismounted first. His boots touched the wet ground softly. He walked forward, his eyes never leaving Jacob. The other riders stayed back, watching everything. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The river hummed softly in the background. The girl took a small step forward, then another, until she was standing right in front of the older man. He looked down at her, his strong face softening. She said something in her language, her voice small but clear. The older man knelt, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Relief washed over his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. Jacob felt something shift in the air, the moment when fear melted into understanding. The older man rose and turned to face Jacob. For a second, they just looked at each other. There were no shared words between them, but words weren't needed. The man gave a small nod, slow and deliberate. It was a gesture Jacob understood well. It was respect. It was gratitude. Jacob nodded back. The riders dismounted one by one, some of them going to the girl, speaking softly to her in their language. She laughed a little, a sound that warmed the cold morning air. The older man stepped closer to Jacob. He spoke a few words in Apache. Jacob didn't understand, but he could hear the tone, deep, steady, and sincere. Jacob placed his hand over his chest and nodded again. It wasn't a big thing, but out here in the wild land where trust was rare, that small exchange meant everything. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the land in warm gold. The river shimmered quietly, the birds sang in the trees, and the girl stood between her people and the man who had saved her. Two worlds had met in one unexpected moment, not with fear, but with kindness. And for Jacob, who had spent so many years in silence, this was the first time in a long while that the world didn't feel quite so lonely. Jacob stood very still as the Apache riders stopped in front of his cabin. The morning sun spread across the land, lighting up the wet ground left behind by the storm. The hooves of their horses left soft marks in the damp soil. The air was clear and quiet. But beneath that quiet was something strong and powerful, the kind of moment where one wrong step could change everything. The young girl's father stood face to face with Jacob now. He was tall, with shoulders broad and firm, and his hair, long and streaked with gray, fell down his back in a neat braid. His face was calm, but there was strength in his eyes, the kind that comes from years of leading and protecting people. His clothes carried the patterns of his people, decorated with beads and soft leather. He looked at Jacob carefully, not with anger, but with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned never to trust too quickly. Jacob didn't speak. He knew words wouldn't help much here. Instead, he kept his hands open and by his sides, showing clearly that he meant no harm. He gave a single, slow nod of respect, the same way he would to another man out on the land. The little girl had already run to her father. She reached him and he knelt down to hold her gently. The way his face softened as he touched her shoulder said everything words could not. Her small hands gripped his arm and her eyes shone with relief. She pointed back toward Jacob's cabin and spoke quickly in her language, her words tumbling out like a stream. The father listened closely, still holding her hand. He turned his head slowly to look back at Jacob. The air between them was different now. It wasn't warm yet, but it wasn't cold either. It was something in between, like a bridge being built from one side of the river to the other, slowly but carefully. Jacob knew he needed to be respectful. He slowly reached up and tipped his hat, a simple gesture, but one that carried meaning on the frontier. The father watched closely, then took a step forward. He spoke a few soft words to one of the riders behind him. The rider nodded, dismounted, and began tying the horses near the cottonwood tree. The girl didn't leave her father's side. She kept glancing at Jacob, her eyes full of quiet excitement. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wanted her father to understand that this man had helped her, that he had pulled her from the cold water. The father finally spoke directly to Jacob. His voice was deep and steady, like the slow roll of distant thunder. Jacob didn't understand the language, but he could feel the weight of the man's words. They were not harsh. They were thoughtful, careful. Jacob didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, listening with full attention. Then the father reached into a small leather pouch tied to his belt. He pulled out a beautiful necklace made of turquoise stones strung together with soft leather. The stones caught the sunlight and shimmered like bits of sky. Slowly, he walked forward and held the necklace out toward Jacob. Jacob blinked. He didn't expect that. This was not just a necklace. He had lived long enough among traders to know what it meant. In Apache culture, turquoise was a symbol of honor, peace, and respect. Giving it away was not a small act. It was a way of saying thank you in the deepest way possible. Jacob raised his hand slowly, almost unsure if he should accept it. He didn't rescue the girl for a reward. He had simply done what any person should do when a child is in danger. But as he looked into the father's eyes, he saw that refusing it might not be right either. The man wasn't trying to pay him. He was honoring him. With quiet respect, Jacob accepted the necklace. He bowed his head slightly. The father gave a slow nod as if acknowledging that Jacob understood the meaning behind the gift. The other Apache riders stood nearby, their faces calm but watchful. They hadn't spoken much, but Jacob could tell they respected their leader deeply. They trusted his judgment. If the father had believed Jacob was dangerous, the atmosphere would have been very different. But the little girl's story, and the way she held on to her father, had changed everything. The father spoke again, softer this time, and placed his hand over his chest. Then he pointed toward Jacob's chest where the necklace now rested in his hand. It was a gesture that carried a message even without words, a promise of peace, a bond of gratitude. Jacob nodded once more. "You're welcome," he said quietly, though he knew the words might not be understood. But tone was a language of its own. The father turned to the girl and spoke to her gently. She smiled, still wrapped in the wool blanket Jacob had given her. She pointed to the cabin again, saying something excitedly. Jacob caught the sound of her laughter, light, like a bell carried by the wind. One of the riders walked up and handed the father a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. The father stepped forward again and offered the bundle to Jacob. Inside were several fine animal hides, soft, carefully tanned, and worth a good amount in town. These were not just things. These were part of his family's wealth. Offering them meant he wanted to give more than just words of thanks. Jacob hesitated again, but the father insisted, gently pushing the bundle toward him. This wasn't about trading. It was about honor. So Jacob accepted it, placing it carefully inside his cabin door. The moment felt quiet and sacred in its own way. Two men from two very different worlds had met in the middle of a dusty clearing by a river, and for a brief time there were no borders or walls between them. There was only a father's love for his child and a stranger's kindness. The father called softly to the girl. She turned back to Jacob with a smile. It wasn't big, but it was bright enough to warm the air between them. She lifted her hand in a small wave, then hurried back to her father's side. The riders began to mount their horses again. The sound of leather creaking and hooves shifting filled the quiet. Jacob stepped back onto his porch, the turquoise necklace still in his hand, the morning sun warming his face. Before leaving, the father turned one last time. He gave Jacob a long, steady look, the kind that carries more meaning than words ever could. Then with calm grace he climbed onto his horse. The girl sat in front of him, wrapped safely in his arms. The group rode away slowly, their horses moving in a straight, quiet line. The sound of their hooves faded into the distance, blending with the soft hum of the river and the whisper of the wind in the cottonwood trees. Jacob stood there long after they disappeared from sight. The porch felt strangely quiet now, as if the land itself was taking a deep breath after something important had passed. He looked down at the necklace in his hand. The turquoise stones glowed softly in the sunlight. It was beautiful, but more than that, it carried a story now. A story about a stormy night, a frightened girl, a worried father, and a quiet man who had not planned to be anyone's hero. Jacob walked inside his cabin and hung the necklace on the wall above the hearth. It didn't look out of place there. In fact, it felt like it had been waiting for that spot all along. He returned to the porch and leaned against the railing, watching the river flow. It was calm again, moving gently like it had forgotten the storm. But Jacob hadn't forgotten. He thought about the way the girl had smiled, the way her father had looked at him, the way kindness had bridged a space that so often held fear. The world out here could be lonely. It could be hard and unforgiving. But moments like this, unexpected, quiet, and powerful, reminded him that it could also be kind. He took a deep breath of the fresh morning air and let the warmth of the sun settle on his face. Life would return to its usual rhythm soon, the fence to mend, the fields to tend, the nights to spend alone by the fire. But something inside him had changed just a little. The necklace on his wall was proof of it. He didn't know if he would ever see that girl again, or her father, or the riders. But he knew he would always remember them. He would remember the way two worlds met at his porch, not with anger, but with trust. And that, he thought, was a story worth carrying. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of the river. Jacob lifted his face to the breeze and closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt something gentle in his chest. Not quite happiness, but close, and somewhere far down the trail, a little girl in her father's arms might have been looking back, remembering the man who had pulled her from the river. The sun had already climbed high by the time the sound of the horses faded completely. The wide Arizona sky stretched out above Jacob's small cabin, a soft blue with only a few white clouds drifting lazily across it. The storm that had shaken the land the night before now felt like a distant memory. Everything smelled fresh. The air was warm but gentle, and the river hummed softly in the background. Jacob stood on his porch for a long time, his eyes fixed on the empty trail where the riders had disappeared. The turquoise necklace still hung around his neck, and the soft weight of it felt like a quiet promise resting against his chest. It wasn't a heavy gift, but it carried meaning far greater than its size. He finally stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the riverbank. The muddy prints from the horses were still fresh in the wet soil. He crouched down, tracing one with his fingers as if to remind himself that the morning wasn't a dream. It had been real. The girl, the riders, her father, all of it had happened right there in front of his quiet home. Jacob had lived alone for so long that moments like these didn't come often. Most of his days passed the same way, fixing fences, chopping wood, mending tools, and sitting by the fire at night. The world outside his cabin moved fast, but his little patch of land remained still. It was a simple life, but a quiet one. Now, as the river shimmered in the sunlight, something inside him felt different. It wasn't loud or overwhelming. It was soft, like the warmth of morning light after a cold night. He had shared a moment with people from a world different than his own, and they had not met as enemies but as human beings. He picked up a small stone from the riverbank and rolled it between his fingers. The water's cool touch still clung to it. He thought about the girl's smile as she waved goodbye, the way her father had looked him in the eye with respect. It wasn't every day a man received such a gift, not just the turquoise necklace, but the feeling behind it. Jacob stood and looked across the river. The water was calm now, smooth like a long ribbon stretching through the land. Just last night it had roared like a wild creature. Now it was peaceful, almost gentle. It reminded him of how quickly life could shift. One moment can be ordinary, and the next can change everything you feel. When he walked back to the cabin, the sun had climbed even higher, lighting up the front of the house. Inside, the fire had burned out, leaving only soft, warm ashes. The blanket the girl had used was still folded neatly on the chair. She had left it behind, but Jacob didn't move it. He let it stay there, as if her small presence still lingered in the room. He placed the turquoise necklace carefully on a hook by the fireplace. It looked beautiful there, glowing softly against the wood. He knew some people might see it as a valuable item, something to sell for a good price in town. But to Jacob, it wasn't about money. It was a symbol of trust, something rare and precious. The bundle of animal hides lay folded on the table. They were finely made, smooth and strong. Jacob ran his hands over them slowly, admiring the careful work. These weren't just hides from an ordinary hunt. They were prepared with care, meant to last. They were a father's way of saying thank you without using words. Jacob decided he would never sell them. They were part of a story now, his story and hers. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch listening to the birds. They flew from branch to branch in the cottonwood trees, singing cheerfully. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, and for the first time in a long time the silence around him felt less heavy. Jacob remembered the way the girl had looked at the door the morning she woke up. She had been scared at first, unsure if she was safe. But then she had stepped into the sunlight. That small moment, when her fear turned into trust, had touched something deep inside him. He didn't talk much with anyone these days, but kindness didn't need many words. It only needed honesty. As the hours passed, he returned to his work, fixing the fence that had fallen in the storm, stacking wood, checking the small field behind his cabin. But everything felt different now. The same land, the same chores, but his thoughts were no longer wrapped in silence. They were alive, filled with the memory of the morning. He thought about the father's face when he saw his daughter, the deep relief in his eyes, the strong, quiet pride in his posture. Jacob had never had children. He had never felt that kind of bond. But for the first time, he understood what it might mean, to love someone so much that the world seems to stop when they're lost, and then start again when they're found. By late afternoon, the sky began to turn gold again, the same warm color it had been the evening before the storm. Jacob walked down to the river once more, carrying his fishing rod. He often fished at this hour, when the water turned still and the air cooled down. It was his quiet time, the part of the day when he felt most at peace. He cast the line and watched the water ripple. The necklace's weight on his chest was light but steady, like a heartbeat. He wasn't used to being part of other people's stories. But now, without even planning it, he had become part of one, a story that would probably be told around someone else's fire tonight, in a language he didn't know but could almost imagine. Somewhere far from his cabin, maybe near the hills or among the tall pines, the girl and her father were together again. He imagined them sitting by their own fire, her wrapped in another blanket, telling him about the man who pulled her from the river. Maybe they would remember his quiet face, his old cabin, his gentle way. Maybe she would remember the lantern glowing on the porch and the warm oatmeal she had eaten after a cold night. The thought made him smile a little. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. As the sky turned orange and pink, Jacob finished fishing and walked back to his porch. He sat down with his old journal and a pencil. It had been months since he'd written anything in it. Most of the pages were filled with notes about the land, when to plant, how much rain had fallen, the number of fish he caught. But that evening, for the first time in a long while, he wrote something different. He wrote about the storm, about hearing a cry in the night, about a young girl with dark hair tangled in the river's current, about pulling her from the water, about her father's quiet strength and the turquoise necklace that now hung by the fire. He didn't use fancy words, just plain, simple sentences, the kind that told the truth. He closed the journal and set it on the table. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked up at the darkening sky. A few stars had already begun to shine. The world felt still again, but it wasn't the same kind of stillness as before. It felt full of quiet meaning. The turquoise necklace glimmered faintly through the cabin window. Jacob knew it wasn't just a decoration. It was a reminder that kindness, even the smallest act, could ripple outward like the river after a stone was thrown into it. As night fell, Jacob lit the lantern on the porch. The soft light glowed warmly, just as it had the night he had heard the cry. But tonight it didn't feel lonely. It felt welcoming. He didn't know if anyone would ever come to his door again, but the light would be there, shining quietly in the dark. The stars multiplied, covering the black sky like scattered diamonds. The river whispered softly, and the wind played with the leaves in the cottonwoods. Jacob closed his eyes and listened. He felt thankful. Not for the reward, but for something much more precious. Thankful for being in the right place at the right time. Thankful for the way the world could surprise a man even when he thought he had seen everything. In the quiet of that night, the story that had begun with a storm and a frightened cry had turned into something warm and lasting. Jacob didn't need anyone to tell him its value. He could feel it in his chest, steady, real, like the rhythm of the land itself. The days after that morning passed slowly, like the soft flow of the river outside Jacob's cabin. The storm was long gone, and the land had returned to its calm, golden rhythm. Every morning the sun rose bright over the hills, the wind carried the sweet scent of cottonwood trees, and the river sparkled like a silver ribbon under the sky. Life in the desert didn't rush. It moved in quiet steps, one sunrise at a time, but for Jacob things didn't feel exactly the same anymore. The cabin walls were the same. The wooden fence was the same. The chores were the same. Yet there was something different in the air, something gentle and warm that hadn't been there before. The turquoise necklace hung on the wall by the fireplace. It caught the sunlight every morning and glimmered softly, like a small piece of the sky had settled inside his home. Every time Jacob saw it, a calm feeling spread through him. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a reminder. A reminder of the night he had pulled a little girl from the river. A reminder of trust, of kindness, and of an unexpected bond between two very different lives. Jacob had lived alone for a long time. His world had become quiet and simple, but now, when he walked down to the river in the evenings, he didn't just hear the water. He remembered the sound of a girl's voice calling out. He remembered the look on her father's face, the mixture of relief, strength, and silent gratitude. Those memories had made a home in his mind. They stayed with him like a steady heartbeat. One evening, about a week later, Jacob sat on his porch watching the sun sink low over the desert. The sky was painted in orange and pink, and the river reflected those colors like a mirror. The world felt soft and wide. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about how quiet his life had been before that storm. Back then, every day had felt the same. He had worked, eaten, slept, and worked again. He had accepted loneliness as just part of life. But now, something had changed inside him. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the way the air feels right before dawn. The moment with the girl and her father had reminded him that even in a life lived far away from town, kindness could find its way in. Jacob had never married. He had once dreamed of it long ago, but life had taken different turns. He had accepted the quiet years without complaint. But helping that little girl, seeing her smile, feeling the father's trust, all of it had opened a soft, unexpected space in his heart. A space that reminded him that life, even in a lonely cabin by a river, still had room for connection. Sometimes at night, he imagined her back with her people. He pictured her sitting by a warm fire under a starry sky, wrapped in a thick blanket. Maybe she told the story to other children, about the storm and the stranger who helped her. Maybe her father would nod quietly as she spoke. The thought made Jacob smile in the dark. He didn't need to be part of their world. It was enough to know he had made a difference. As the weeks passed, small changes began to happen around the cabin. Jacob planted a few more flowers near the porch. He fixed the old swing he had built years ago but never used. He began to keep the lantern on the porch lit longer at night. Not because he expected someone to come, but because it made the place feel alive, warm, welcoming. One late afternoon, he was walking near the river, his boots crunching softly on the dry ground. He crouched near the water and dipped his hands into the cool current. It was calm, clear, and gentle. He remembered how wild it had been that night, how strong the current had felt. The river was like life itself, always moving, changing from quiet to storm and back again. He sat on a rock by the water's edge and looked up at the horizon. A hawk circled above, floating on the wind. In that quiet, he understood something simple but important. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life don't come with big plans or warnings. They just appear, like a sudden rain in the desert. The next time he went into town for supplies, people at the general store greeted him with their usual polite nods. Jacob wasn't the kind of man who shared stories easily, but something about him had changed. His steps were a little lighter, his eyes a little softer. When the shopkeeper asked if everything was fine out at the cabin, Jacob simply nodded with a small smile. He didn't need to tell them the story. It belonged to him now, quiet, real, and strong. He picked up sugar, flour, coffee, and some nails for the fence. But as he walked back to his wagon, he passed by the glass case where a few old trinkets were kept. There, among them, he saw turquoise stones. He stopped for a moment. The stones didn't shine like the one he had at home. They were ordinary, but they made him think of that morning. The father, the girl, the riders, the sky full of sunlight. He walked out of the store with a thoughtful look in his eyes. Back at the cabin, he set the supplies down and looked at the necklace again. It hung by the fire, exactly where he had placed it. This time, though, he didn't just look at it. He took it down carefully and held it in his hands. The cool stones warmed slowly against his skin. He thought about how that simple gift had carried so much meaning. Not just gratitude, but trust, respect, and a promise that kindness can live even in a harsh land. He ran his thumb across one of the stones, then placed it gently back on the wall. It was a quiet moment, but a powerful one. Seasons began to change. The summer sun grew hotter, The fields turned dry and the river shrank a little but still flowed steadily. Life went on as it always did, but Jacob felt less alone now. Every sunset, every breeze that came down from the hills, every soft ripple of the river carried a memory that gave his days more meaning. Sometimes, when the air grew still and the world fell quiet at night, Jacob would sit on his porch, his hands resting on his knees, and imagine what the little girl's life might be like now. Maybe she had grown stronger, running barefoot through the fields near her village. Maybe she would remember the storm, the warm blanket, the man who said nothing but made her feel safe. And somewhere deep inside, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that lives deep in a person's chest when they know they've done something good, something real. Years later, the turquoise necklace still hung in the same spot by the fire. Visitors who passed through his cabin, a rare traveler, an old friend from town, often noticed it. Some would ask where he got it. Jacob would smile and say only, "It's a gift from a good story." He never explained the whole thing, because the real meaning was something only he and that family would ever truly understand. The river kept flowing. The seasons kept changing, and Jacob kept living his quiet life. But his world was no longer just walls and chores. It was wider now, richer, filled with a story that would live with him forever. One evening, as the sky glowed gold, Jacob stood by the river one last time for the day. The breeze brushed gently across his face. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He didn't need to see the girl or the riders again. It was enough to know their lives had crossed paths in a way that mattered. He whispered softly to the wind, "Be well, little one," even though no one else was there to hear it. And as the sun disappeared behind the hills, the river glimmered like a trail of light leading toward the horizon. Jacob turned back toward his cabin, the warm glow of his lantern welcoming him home. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a place where a story lived. A story about kindness, trust, and a moment in the Wild West when hearts understood each other without needing a single shared word. The necklace caught the last light of the day and sparkled like a quiet star inside the room. Jacob smiled, feeling calm and whole. Sometimes real stories don't end with big celebrations. They end quietly, like a river flowing under the moon, steady, simple, and unforgettable.